Everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid.
The words of Einstein help to open our discussion today on learning, its complexity, the anatomy behind it, and how it looks different for every individual. Lesson A, First Impressions.
In addressing implicit and explicit biases, we must address that they exist and unfortunately are very common. Statistically speaking, of these three pictures, people would likely state that the innocent-looking girl on the left is the most likely to be well-behaved, despite her being an alleged piece of work in class. As educators, our first and foremost responsibility is to provide a fair and equal education to each student that passes through the door. In our lives as students, we have all experienced a teacher that has not lived up to this standard. Oftentimes, this manifests from biases held by teachers. When these biases are expressed and clearly evident to students, this is called an explicit bias. When my fourth grade teacher expressed to the class the reason for her retirement was because of my habit to ask too many questions, she showed her explicit bias. When this bias is present but not expressed, this is called implicit bias. Unfair treatment within the classroom often is quiet, subtle, and implicit, but has a profound effect on students.
The banking model of education was an idea posed by this man, Paulo Freire, author of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Freire uses an analogy of a bank to describe this model. Teachers are the depositors and students are the depository. That is, teachers simply fill students' minds with information, a process which, in essence, is meaningless. Freire argued that this form of education does not foster creative, critical thinking in students that is so essential to their educational development. So, he offered an alternative, what he calls problem-posing education. The students in this photo are partaking in a Socratic seminar discussion, during which the students sit in a council-like circle, facilitating discussion of a topic and working to prove arguments. As a student-led activity, this promotes mutual humanization, recognition that students and teachers are humans alike. Problem-posing education involves critical thinking, questioning, and the creative potential of students. This system pushes students to think deeply and resourcefully and to go beyond textbooks and conventions. This method involves a student-teacher contradiction, a condition in which both students and educators are learners and teachers. Lesson B, what is learning? Educational psychology is the process of how teachers teach, how students learn, and the dynamic process that happens between them. Throughout this lesson, you will see how many factors play into the various processes of learning, including the capacities of the human brain and approaches to schooling.
In addressing the human brain, the brain is commonly thought of as fixed, meaning the brain is wired a specific way and we learn through this wiring. The reality could not be farther from that misconception. The brain is ever-changing and malleable. Every time a new task is learned, a new neural pathway is created. This is best seen in the sometimes tedious process of learning to ride a bike or learning to write. After many attempts and failures, you finally learn, and the brain itself changes as it makes a new neural connection. Finding yourself in an unfamiliar situation, like entering a classroom for the first time, our first instinct is to look around and observe what those surrounding you are doing. The first mode the brain turns to is imitation, an action that is inherent within the human brain. The only thing preventing this from occurring is inhibition within the frontal lobe. Nevertheless, this is incredibly applicable within education, especially looking at easy ways for children to learn. Showing children how to do a task will almost always be more effective than verbally explaining each step, because students can observe and imitate. This is most commonly in foreign languages, classes, sports, and acting. Getting into neurons. Neurons are responsible for transmitting nerve impulses throughout the brain. The brain contains around 100 billion of these, creating a massive amount of neural pathways. Neurons contain three main parts: dendrites, which receive incoming nerve signals from the axon. The axon sends out signals called neurotransmitters for the dendrites of another neuron to be received. These messages are created within the cell body or soma, where the DNA of the neuron is held. Neurons and neural pathways as a whole allow us to properly send and receive information for senses, motor function, and internal processes. Moving on to some very fast brain fast facts. First, the brain is 3 pounds, has the consistency of jello. The frontal lobe is responsible for higher thinking, so when you make a dumb mistake, you hit your forehead where that frontal lobe made that mistake. The brain contains around 100 billion neurons, and the corpus callosum is the rubber band-looking thing responsible for holding the left and right brain together.
Enhancing learning in the classroom can often be done through sensory variation. Learning is a complex process unique to each individual, and often what works for one student looks different for another. Incorporating movement into lessons can be beneficial because linking information kinesthetically helps improve long-term memory of material. Auditory supplements have been shown to enhance learning as well. Music incorporated into lessons improves engagement and can also help shape the overall environment of the classroom, proving an effective management tool. Other students are visual learners and reach their best potential when they have something to look at coinciding with what they are receiving through their other senses. For example, graphic novels as an assignment or a supplement have been shown to help students improve their reading comprehension and literacy skills. Another tool for enhancing education is called chunking. As opposed to index order, where students learn the same material for an extended period of time or tackle all the material in its whole, chunking allows for students to divide up the material into sections or for instructors to break apart the information into smaller lessons or categories. The student here applies chunking to memorize a sequence of numbers by memorizing them in 3 segments of 3, instead of all 9 numbers in one line.
Each individual student learns differently, but there are methods of teaching that will across the board help each student in retaining more knowledge. My advanced composition class in high school was taught by a new young teacher who taught drastically different than the other advanced composition class. The other class was lecture-based and was assigned a great deal of tedious homework, whereas my class had an occasional writing assignment, but the majority of our learning came from in-class discussions, workshops, and teaching others, all the participatory teaching methods. The other teacher looked down upon our class because we did not work as hard, according to her, but our class passed the AP test at an 82% rate, while hers a 42%. This is a prime example of how using participatory teaching methods allows students to retain more information than passive teaching methods.
Perplexity in education is what happens when a student doesn't know something, has a desire to know that thing, and believes that knowing it is within his or her power. This is an incredibly powerful thing in education. It is thought-provoking, intellect-stirring, and truly a mark of growth within human development. It demonstrates human curiosity, understanding, and a desire to know and learn. Throughout my own schooling, my greatest moments of perplexity occurred while reading these novels: Life of Pi by Jan Martel, The Giver by Lois Lowry, and A Separate Peace by John Knowles. Walking alongside the complex and very real characters of these stories left me confused, bewildered, without answers, and desiring to understand. I knew the facts, but the truths were a mystery. I wasn't even sure what to make of them or what I believed. Literature like this, when taught with passion and mutual humanization, can leave students perplexed in the moment and for many years into their adulthood. Lesson C, Moral and Social Development. Erik Erikson was an American-German psychologist and theorist who developed a set of stages of psychosocial development, each stage marked by a crisis which contributes to development and resolution at that age. Infants face trust versus mistrust in their surrounding environment, as they are dependent at this age on other people for their survival. In early childhood, from ages 2 to 3, individuals face the crisis of autonomy versus doubt. This is a photo of a 3-year-old boy I nanny named Ethan, who is currently being challenged by this stage in the balance between freedom and exploration and overprotection by parents and authority figures. Children are faced with initiative versus guilt, attempting to take independent action and sometimes suffering the consequences of these actions. Here's another photo of Ethan, who is transitioning into this stage as he begins initiating his own projects and play creations. In later childhood, children face industry versus inferiority, taking pride in their feeling of purpose and work, but also at times feeling discouraged by their limitations. Identity versus role confusion is the crisis of adolescence. Here's a photo of me from my first day of high school and my dad at his 10th grade homecoming dance. During this awkward and transitional phase, teenagers are learning to develop an awareness of who they are and what their purpose is in the real world. It is a time of understanding, of uncertainty, but a time of exploration, wandering and forming oneself, breaking away from childhood and seeking a new stability. Young adulthood is marked by intimacy versus isolation. Will I spend my life with others or live within myself? Adulthood is the crisis of generativity versus stagnation. Will I contribute to the world and leave something for the next generation, or will I succumb to self-indulgence and self-interest? And finally, the stage of maturity, where humans face integrity versus despair. Bronfenbrenner was a Russian-born American psychologist who developed the ecological systems of theory of child development, which designates 5 environmental systems with which an individual interacts. The first is the individual themselves, followed by the microsystem, the individual's direct interaction with activities, roles, and relations with others, their immediate environment. Then comes the mesosystem, involving connections between systems and microsystems, and after this, the exosystem, which involves one's indirect environment. The macrosystem involves the larger, understood social and cultural values, and the chronosystem constitutes the things that might change over time. This system of thought is practiced by the group of young men I worked with last year residing at Camp David Gonzalez Probation Center. The teacher of these boys often focused on larger, more worldly applications and connections in every subject they discussed, from math to social studies to English, to help remove them from the small circle of gang life they had found themselves so stuck in. This approach employed Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems for a more practical comprehension for these boys.
Another theory came to be from an interesting experiment on observed behavior and aggression. Albert Bandura demonstrated that preschool children learn a great deal from observing the behavior of adults. He tested this by showing preschool children 3 different videos, one with an adult showing an aggressive behavior model toward a plastic doll, one non-aggressive, and one neither. Of course, the group that was shown the aggressive behavior showed hostility and aggression towards the doll, as seen here. Moving on to a theorist heavily influenced by Jean Piaget, we have Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development, which details 6 stages divided into 3 levels. The first level, called pre-conventional morality, is where children can now grasp, where children are guided by rewards and punishments. Stage 1 states that punishment must be avoided for your own comfort. Stage 2 states that they become less egocentric and recognize the benefits of cooperation. This picture of me as a preschooler shows my distaste for punishment. The second level, called conventional morality, is where children can now grasp social rules and gain a more objective perspective on right and wrong. Stage 3 of this states the motivation for good behavior comes from social approval of those closest, and stage 4 states that they desire to maintain their own social conventions. This picture of me and my classmates shows my desire for social approval, but eventually would grow out of these friends as I moved on to the next stage. The final level, called post-conventional morality, states that the person is no longer on conventional or societal standards of morality, but rather on their own personal or idealized principles. Stage 5 is where they now can understand that laws are created for benefit of all citizens and unjust laws should be changed. Stage 6, a stage reached by very few, states that these few people judge right and wrong not by rules and laws, but by individual reflection on what is proper behavior. Kohlberg saw these stages as a one-way process with no regression, whereas critics would say his theory serves more to show the spectrum of where people can fall in terms of moral development. The Heinz dilemma is a commonly used method of determining the correct stage of development, using the scenario of choosing whether or not to steal a drug that's price has been inflated in order to save a woman on her deathbed.
Nell Noddings is an American feminist, educationalist, and philosopher who preached the importance of whole child education, which puts value not in just the student's cognition, but also in their physical, social, and emotional capabilities and needs. Carol Gilligan explained development in terms of the stages of care. According to Gilligan, humans begin with the pre-conventional goal of individual survival. Over time, they transition to the conventional goal, which views self-sacrifice as goodness. And eventually, they reach the post-conventional stage, which values the principle of all-around nonviolence, not hurting oneself nor others. The process of learning looks different for every individual. There is no timeline, no direct path. Robert Frost captures, through his poetry, this diversity of education. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one last traveled by, and that has made the difference. This is true of all learners, but it is true of educators too. With this diversity in mind, what path will you choose as an educator? Is there a right and a wrong to education? What will be your philosophy?